has been built around the idea of conveying the message that it's personal, that generally speaking, adults don't come to faith in Christ because they answer all of their questions or they overcome all of the obstacles to faith that exist in their life. That it just doesn't happen that way, that they get the answers that they're looking for and suddenly they become a Christian. What happens is God gets personal with them. That this Christianity thing moves from being a category to becoming personal. And when that happens, those questions that they have shrink. The obstacles that they didn't think they could overcome are suddenly a little bit more easily overcome in light of the personal relationship with God. That's how adults come to faith. And we've been trying to say it as many ways as we can. And if you were here, for the first week, we kind of went over, the different things that guys, and I'll just hold it. Different things that guys go through, when it comes to getting married. They just, they worry about their freedom, and they worry about commitment and money, and they have all these obstacles to getting married, and then they meet her. And when marriage goes from being some category to being a personal relationship with another person, suddenly these questions are still here. They just get a lot smaller, because they just all of a sudden freedom in light of this relationship doesn't matter so much. Commitment, wow, I actually want that person committed to me as much as I want to be committed to them. And some of these things change because suddenly it gets really personal. And that's how people fall in love. Then we also can see that there's other questions that people have. People have legitimate questions about the reliability of the Bible. They have questions about how can there be a good God who loves the world and yet allows all this suffering. And they can have all sorts of obstacles and questions that they have in regards to Christianity, in regards to faith in God. And those aren't overcome simply by getting good answers. What overcomes them is when something happens that makes it personal. What overcomes that is suddenly when the doctor diagnoses cancer and a person doesn't really care about these questions anymore. They just want to know the God who's real. When suddenly they're faced with a reality that they need a personal God, and these questions are still here, they're just not as important as an encounter with the real God, with a God who's personal. You see, because a lot of these questions fall in an unexplainable category for a lot of people. The video showed a guy faced with an unexplainable situation, and so he began to insert an explanation. His children were born with autism, and so he began to insert the answer to the question of why with, well, it was because of me, because God's mad at me. And suddenly there was this giant obstacle. But then he encountered the words of Christ in John chapter 9, the very passage we talked about last week, and suddenly realized his explanation wasn't the explanation. That it wasn't because of his sin that his children were born with autism. And suddenly God's undeniable love started to shine through. And it overwhelmed the unexplainable. We talked about it last week. We live as human beings with the undeniable. We never bank on the unexplainable. We wouldn't be able to drive our cars if we had to explain everything about how they work. We wouldn't be able to fly in an airplane if we had to know everything about how they work before we did it. We just simply know, I get in my car, it starts, I drive. That's undeniable. Then I can live with the unexplainable. We do it all the time. We just don't typically transfer that to faith. In faith, when it comes to faith, well, we just want to have all these obstacles that have to be explained first. Now, what I'm saying is not to say that those questions aren't valuable, that somehow you need to disregard any objections, obstacles, questions that you have. You just need to put them aside and grab onto faith. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is you need to put them in the context of a relationship with God. You need to put them in the context where they actually have a chance of being answered or overcome. And that's through a personal encounter with God. An undeniable experience will trump the lack of explanations that we may have. And then finally, today I want to focus on some questions. And most of the questions and obstacles that we have regarding a relationship with Christ fall into the what about and why would category. Well, yeah, I would love to believe in God, but what about all those people that aren't Christian? What about all those people that suffer in the world? What about this? What about that? And there are a lot of questions that trip us up when it comes to faith in Christ that are in the what about category. And then there's the why would category. Why would a loving God do this? Why would God be this way and not this way? And we have a lot of things that focus on the what about and why would. What about God? Would God create, can God create a rock he can't move? You know, and we get caught into these little loops of philosophical thinking, and they're death traps. Because you can get answers to the what about and why would and still not know God. I could give you books on what about and why would, and you'd have a lot more information about God, but that doesn't mean that you've encountered him. It doesn't mean that it's personal. It's just informational. See, the thing that I look at as in regards to closing out this series is to get you to focus on two questions. That doesn't mean that the other questions disappear. But I can tell you, the two questions that I want to share with you today are the questions you've got to wrestle to the ground first. They're the first two questions to consider when you're thinking about a relationship with God through Christ. And they're very simply, who is and what happened? All right? Can you all skate with me for a second? Who is, what happened? Ready? Who is, what happened? Those are the two primary questions. And really, the easier one is the what happened question. And it's the one that we do have to wrestle to the ground when it comes to Christianity above all the others, because Christianity at its base is not developed on moral teachings. I mean, what Christianity is built on isn't simply the teachings of Christ. Now, that might surprise you, because if you go to a church, that's what you hear is the teachings of Christ. And yes, the teachings are meant to inform our lives and to give us God's opinion and view on how to live life best. But that's not the basis of Christianity. Christianity didn't start with the teachings of Christ. Christianity starts with a happening. What is the biggest holiday in the Christian calendar? Anybody know what it is? Easter. Yes, because even back in the days when you didn't go to church in the fall, you went to church in the spring, right? You would show up on Easter. Because Easter is an event that happened. See, the early Christians didn't die because of what Jesus taught. They died because they wouldn't deny what they saw. And what they saw was a guy say, listen, the religious leaders are going to put me to death, but in 3 days, I'm going to come back to life. And over 300 witnesses saw him come back to life. And they began to spread this news about Jesus, the guy who said he was going to die for us and that he was going to come back to life. It really happened. He really did come back to life. It's the what happened part of the question. And 2,000 years later, we still celebrate what happened because it's the foundation of our faith. If it wasn't for the resurrection, if Christ didn't rise, forget what he taught, because he was a liar. Forget what he taught, because really, the only reason he has authority to say that is because this happened. Christianity is built on a fact, not just on a belief system or moral codes. Because the fact informs us of the second question. And that's the primary question all of us have to ask when it comes to a relationship with God. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? The answer to that question is the most important answer you'll ever seek. Who is Jesus? Because if Jesus is who he says he is, because this event really happened, well, that puts all of our other questions into a whole different context. Because if Jesus is who he says he is, then we can trust what he says, and then what he says informs the answers to the questions that we have. Then what Jesus says all of a sudden begins to go after some of the obstacles. And some of the obstacles get answered and overcome. Others of them just simply go away in light of the reality of who Jesus is.